Hello. Woohoo! So I'm between you and the end of this, so let's get the energy levels going. So I am a small friend of Sopra Steria, small and perfectly formed. I work for a startup company of 13 people based in Edinburgh, Scotland. I think you might have heard of some of that in the introduction there, but I don't speak Swedish, so if I'm repeating myself, I apologize. So we in Wallet.Services are building software that helps organizations share information and keep it secure. And here we are at a Power of Sharing event, so it's an auspicious place to talk about this platform and the underlying technology of our software, which is blockchain. Sharing is incredibly important to society, to civic society, the way that we collaborate. And sharing is important to business in terms of how we can transact efficiently with other businesses and citizens and consumers. So sharing is nothing. It just doesn't work if we can't trust that person that we are interacting with, or as a business, if we can't trust that business whose network we are in. So trust is very important, and blockchain as a technology is something which addresses this issue of trust. It provides some new ways, a generation into the internet age, to enable trust between people and business and organizations like government. And potentially it can enable some new ways of doing business, new business models. And really in my discussion today, I want to talk about some of those models with some concrete, real examples that my small company has been through over the past 2 years. Double click. So we want to share, but life is a bit unsatisfactory in the internet age because our life is complicated. It is disconnected and difficult to share information. The internet's promise was of a distributed, connected world, but I'm remembering now 26 years ago when I first used the Mosaic internet browser, the digital interactions that we experience haven't quite realized that potential. I'll give you a personal example from just over 2 years ago when I started a company in the United Kingdom, in Scotland. That process took me a month, even though I wanted to get going straight away. I had to interact with 3 different government agencies. I had to exchange sensitive information with those agencies. I had to interact with a couple of banks and private organizations, again resharing the same sensitive information. And finally, I received information that wasn't reliable from the bank. They sent me a bank account number so that we could get our business started, but it was the wrong bank account number. And I started Wallet.Services by transferring a significant financial sum into somebody else's bank account. So the month became 2 months, and the story has a happy ending because the Royal Bank of Scotland gave us a free coffee machine to make up for that. So the contemporary web tools that we have in our digital age are really not adequate for how we have to support our digital life. And I'm not the only one to think so. Looking back 25, 26 years ago, when I first used that Mosaic browser, Tim Berners-Lee, who's generally accepted to be the father of the web, he also thinks we need new tools. And he revealed last month what he'd been working on at MIT for the past several years, and that was a trust platform for the internet. He believes that the power of some of these data collection companies such as Facebook, Amazon, and Google has become too concentrated, and it's made them too powerful. And sometimes they betray that trust. You only have to look at the data breaches that we see every day, notable breaches such as the Indian government's Aadhaar system, where they lost the details of over 1 billion citizens. And the one that we actually hear a bit more about is more of a deliberate mistake where Facebook exposed information to Cambridge Analytica of 87 million of their customers in ways which those customers had not agreed to. So Tim's Solid project is coming back to fix the internet. And it's based on a trust framework built around distributed ledger and blockchain technologies. So that's the role of blockchain. It's about distributing trust and enabling safe sharing of data and transactions. I'm not going to attempt to explain how Bitcoin and blockchain works. If you want to know that, go onto YouTube and look at any of the animations, which will probably confuse you even further. But we should understand some of the things that it can do for us, because these technologies can guarantee that data is authentic in a world of fake news. They can help us share data so that we can do business, but retain control over that data so that if the person we've shared the data with can't reshare that data on our behalf. And famously, it reduces the role of intermediaries in this data exchange. And there's implications for probably many of the organizations who are represented here today. Anybody who has to manage citizen or consumer data on their behalf, any of sensitive information that they have to control, or any organization who has to collaborate with other organizations within a business community. These are technologies which can potentially address some of their concerns. But what should enterprises know about blockchain technologies? Where did it come from? Well, the first thing to know that blockchain is kind of a colloquial term. It comes from the wider field of distributed ledger technologies, which have been around for much longer than the past 10 years. Most people have heard of Bitcoin, which is about 10 years old. And it was a public global trust network that enables the secure exchange of value between consumers. And I think that its inventors probably didn't realize that their little proof of concept would become so successful. The scheme has a lot of problems and it doesn't necessarily scale very well. But it's taken billions out of the financial services industry that it was an experiment that was supposed to disrupt. In the past 5 years, these technologies have matured. So we now work with V2 blockchains like Ethereum and Hyperledger. These have added the ability for automated contracts. And crucially, they've moved into the private blockchain world, where we enable not just consumers to interact with businesses, but for businesses to interact with each other in a trusted way. In the next 5 years, many people predict that these technologies will become technologies which find their way into all web applications. They'll become invisible technologies, a bit like relational databases are today. And analyst organizations predict various increasing levels of billions that this market will be worth in the next 5 years. But certainly it's already had a big impact on the financial services industry. And I'm going to talk about some of the applications we've worked on in the crunchier engineering industries and in government. So, first of all, in these real-world applications of blockchain, this is a technology that's still at the MS-DOS stage of the PC revolution. It's still very early days. But one particular area where we have worked, and in our learning journey in Wallet.Services, is in public services, in government. And we had the privilege of building a report, which you see pictured there. It's available for anybody to download from our website, We built this for Scottish Government, and it included a survey of the use cases we saw in government all around the world. By the end of last year, we'd counted 180 different proof of concepts from global governments. And we wrote about that to explain what its position was in enabling these scenarios. We found scenarios where blockchain was being applied to health and social care data, that sensitive data that people want to protect, preserving privacy and confidentiality. We heard about the proof of concept here in Sweden from the Landmateriat. That's the first Swedish word. I hope I've pronounced that correct. I only know 2 Swedish words, so we're 50% of the way there, where they'd looked at scenarios where government has an intermediary function in supporting transactions in the business community. And it's also in use in some countries, for example, in the Republic of Estonia, where it's used for audit of those transactions which public officials use to access citizens' data, basically used as a big auditing system so that citizens can trust their government. So I would encourage you to download that report. It is written in English, but if enough people ask, we'll translate it into Swedish. So moving on, I'm going to talk about several scenarios that we were involved with in our learning journey about how to apply blockchain to government and industrial use cases. So my apologies if I'm being too provincial here. Many of these scenarios are based in Scotland, where we've been working for the past 2 years. So the first scenario we got involved with through our friends at Sopra, who'd been conducting a study into permit and license application processes in government. And they made some interesting findings. They found that there were 180 different agencies just in Scotland who issued permits and licenses, often at processing costs of up to £100. So we thought that this would be a very interesting thing to look at, and we looked at a process around applications for air weapon certificates, air guns. And we built a system that connected local government, central government, and law enforcement in a paper-free application process. It streamlined the citizen experience in our prototype, and it improved security around the very sensitive data. It included mental health data and so on around in this application process, and gave verifiable compliance that all of the checks and balances had been carried out before a license was issued to a citizen. So we learned from this. This was one of the first applications of blockchain in public services, and we learned how to build inter-organizational business processes to connect multiple organizations who didn't necessarily completely trust each other. So we moved on from that simple example to a much more complex example involving many more organizations and much more complex data, and that was manufacturing records in the subsea oil and gas industry. We built a manufacturing records book which basically showed the chain of custody around these manufactured assets and all of their component parts amongst a network of oil operators, their suppliers, and all of the contractors that are involved in building these very complex manufactured systems. And we were able to prove the value of improved safety, compliance with regulation throughout that whole commissioning, operations, and decommissioning of these expensive assets. So we learned a huge amount from that project around these more complex inter-organizational processes, how those organizations required their data to be shared but protected. And that will move into a pilot early next year in the North Sea oil and gas industry, including some substantial global oil players. Earlier this year, we turned our attention to the commercial world and collating commercial data from a consortium of competing companies. This was in a response to a new Scottish government law which enabled councils, local authorities, to place rent controls on residential rented properties to control the price of them so that they couldn't rise too quickly. The difficulty here was that all of the residential letting agents were competitors, and it had been impossible to gather a data set which allowed the rental data to be provably authentic, but also protected these competitors from the commercial confidences that they didn't want to betray to their own competitors. So a very interesting project. And we learned from that project that it's possible to put in place with these technologies a trust network which enables a data set that really wouldn't otherwise be possible to deliver. And I come back to the start now, because where we started around government processes, around the air weapons certificate, next year we will move into production with the National Entitlement Card, which is a card, an identity card that's given to every 12-year-old in Scotland, and it gives them entitlement to various benefits such as discounted travel, enables them to prove their age, and we'll be building the underlying processes around how particular young people can be enabled with specific benefits and entitlements based on their need. And really, it's at this point that these blockchain technologies and the experiments that have been carried out over the past 2 years are now truly moving into production. So to finish off with a slight advertising break, we've learned from all of these applications, and we've synthesized that learning into our business process platform, Sicker. And we work with Sopra around using this for rapid prototyping of how blockchain innovation can be adopted by enterprises. So I would encourage you to learn about this technology, experiment and exploit the power of sharing with blockchain, and potentially exploit a new and disruptive technology. And with that, my second Swedish word, tack!